Hey everyone, this is Brian from the Tennis IQ podcast. Josh and I hope that you are enjoying the content and discussions that we put out week after week. If you'd like to support the podcast and help us to continue to produce quality episodes, please visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/tennisiqpodcast/membership. Currently, we have 3 tiers of support: the fan level at $3 per month, the supporter level at $7 per month, and the champion level at $20 per month. Benefits of joining the Tennis IQ podcast community include episode transcripts, participation in book club discussions, and access to monthly masterclasses with me and Josh. For more on these benefits of support, head on over to our Patreon page at patreon.com/tennisiqpodcast/membership. Thank you so much. And now, on to the show.
Welcome to the Tennis IQ podcast. I'm Josh Berger.
And I'm Brian Lomax. And today we are going to talk about a quote that I got from the Brain Food weekly email from Farnham Street. It's a Farnham Street blog. So it's if you like to read kind of good and different ideas, it's a good newsletter to subscribe to. It comes every Sunday. And there was a quote in this one from this past Sunday that I read, and it was from a CEO, chairman and CEO of a cloud data company called Snowflake, and it was really excerpted from a conversation that this CEO, Frank Slootman, had with the Farnham Street blog. So the quote is this: "Performance is something that we will give more time. Behavior, we won't. And that's because behavior is a choice, not a skill set." So I'm just going to read that again, Josh, just make it clear. Performance is something that we will give more time. Behavior, we won't. And that's because behavior is a choice, not a skill set. So obviously this quote comes from the world of business, which of course is a performance context. How do we relate this to tennis? And when I read this on Sunday morning, I was like, it's really interesting. And it reminded me of some things that some clients are going through where perhaps their behavior on court is not as great as it could be. And maybe that's also part of the reason they're not getting the performance and the results they're looking for. So I think we can really look at this quote from, what does it mean to have patience with performance or give it more time? And what does it mean to try to be more immediate with addressing behavior in that way? So, I know I sent you this quote earlier this week, and just to get your thoughts first, Josh, on what you thought of it.
Yeah, I thought it was very interesting. I mean, I think sort of the starting point I would take is, behavior being a choice. And I think I broadly, well, I think in a certain way I agree, and in a certain way I disagree with that. I mean, I think behavior is definitely controllable. And when we think about, what is and is not controllable, and there are obviously plenty of factors outside of our control, behavior is one of those factors that we can control and we can impact, though it takes time. I think in a certain way, I think the quote could be seen as saying, behavior is a choice or is controllable, so therefore it's like a given. And I don't think that's necessarily always the case. I think behavior really is a skill, is something that we can work and improve on over time. I mean, I think we can look at, I think there's plenty of examples of this from people, such as Roger Federer. I think there's, countless examples of, tennis players of all different levels who have changed their behavior over time, who maybe at one period of time were throwing their rackets, maybe they weren't making the best line calls or their sportsmanship wasn't the best. But over time, they changed and they improved. And, so I think we want to have the attitude that people can improve at all sorts of things, including their behavior, certainly. But I agree in terms of, sort of separating these two variables of performance and behavior and saying, behavior is maybe more controllable, maybe more of a choice, maybe is a little bit simpler to try to improve. And performance in general is maybe a byproduct of many of these different facets: our behavior, our attitude, our effort, the training that we do on a daily basis, our awareness, many different ingredients maybe leads to our performance. But I think behavior is one piece of that. And I do agree that it's a choice and it's controllable, though I do think it can take work.
For sure. And I think that's one thing we're in agreement on this quote is that, and then we disagree on the quote is, I think we believe that behavior is a skill set. And if we look at many of the behaviors that we find productive in tennis, there are levels of proficiency at those behaviors that take practice. And it's not just a choice to, wrong behavior, correct behavior, because even the correct behavior, there's a level of proficiency that goes with that. The performance side, of course, behaviors and performances are related, but performance is something that's not fully within our control. We have some influence on it, but it's also not fully out of our control, right? So the part that we can influence it with is making the right choices and doing the right behaviors, taking the right actions there. So I think it's important to understand the relationship of that. When we have not the best behaviors, it does tend to be counterproductive to the outcome. And maybe that gets a little bit back to our optimism, pessimism piece, right? In that if we're going to be doing things or thinking things that are counter to the mission at hand, and that could be different on each day, but one of our overall missions is to try to become the best player we can become. Maybe on today, it's trying to, win this match. That might be the mission. We want to make sure that our behaviors are in line with achieving that. And sometimes they're not. And therefore your ability to create a good performance lessens. So I think it's important to understand that relationship between the two, the performance and the behaviors. Behaviors does not necessarily 100% lead to great performance, but it gives you a much better chance on that piece of things, right? And I think performance, as we've discussed in episodes in the past, Josh, is really the outcome of our own systems, as well as, some outside factors like our opponent, officials, maybe court conditions, weather. There's a lot that goes into it. But a big part of it is the systems that we create, which are really your behaviors, your habits, your schedule, all those controllables that I know you love talking about the controllables with people as one of the first things that you do. And which is, makes a ton of sense, is to get people to realize how much they actually do control. Because I think in some ways people don't realize how much they can control.
Definitely. And can we be really clear about what's in our control and what's out of our control? And I think oftentimes when I bring up that topic, whether that's to a group or team, whether that's to an individual, I often get different sorts of responses. Sometimes maybe it's a brand new concept. Maybe sometimes from the name of the concept, they can sort of figure out what it means. Oftentimes I find that people have sort of heard of this concept, maybe from a parent, maybe from a coach at some point, but I think it's sort of a phrase that gets thrown around sometimes. Oh, control the controllables, control what you can control. But I think being really clear about what can I control and what can't I? And often like starting with, okay, what can't I control? Let's be really clear about that. And I know we did with a recent masterclass, we talked about, you talked about the circle of, the performance circle, and, what are some of the factors that are sort of within that circle or outside of it in terms of, what's controllable and what isn't. But just really being clear about what are certain things that maybe I can't control, that I don't want to put my effort and my focus, my attention towards those things. Can I really be clear about what can I control? Behavior or elements of my behavior being one of them, my sportsmanship being another, my attitude, my decision making, my how I prepare, how I reflect, some of these different pieces. So I think the more that we can be clear about that, and I think in many ways it's a very basic concept. I think it's a concept that people of different ages and ability levels can pretty quickly understand. I think it's a I think the question of is this in my control or not is a question that we can keep coming back to. I think it's a very simple yet important, profound question that we can apply to tennis and maybe other areas of life. And I think once we're able to maybe determine certain aspects that are within our control, like our behavior, for instance, or at least the elements of our behavior are controllable, then I think the next step is, can we start really coming up with a game plan for how we want to handle these controllables? I recently heard a sports psychology professional talking about this concept in a slightly different way. And he said, instead of controlling the controllables, let's focus on mastering the controllables. Let's be really clear about what are those aspects of our performance that are controllable, and let's make sure that we're really trying to master some of these areas and really trying to do each of these elements at the absolute highest level. Like, let's make sure that our effort and our behavior are not just good, not just passable, but excellent, right? How can we get to that level? So I think sometimes aspects of this concept are maybe just swept under the rug. It's like, oh yeah, I had a good attitude, or yeah, I prepared well, but okay, are we really making sure that we're mastering some of these aspects? And I think that's maybe a slightly different perspective, or a different way of thinking about things.
And that also, the use of the word mastery implies that this is a skill set. So, sort of contradicting the quote a little bit, that this certainly is a skill set. I think another, like when we talk about you having that conversation with athletes, or I have that conversation with athletes, and we ask them, okay, start listing out all the things you can control. A lot of times they don't come up with that much. And very often I'll kind of like seed the discussion with, all right, here, I'll get you started, attitude and effort. And then even still, you don't get a lot there. And so I think, Josh, there's a level of not ignorance, but almost being oblivious to the concept around you do have a choice of how to act in this way. And this is not just a junior tennis thing. I mean, I was at a tournament this past weekend, 55 and over. So it's 55, 65, 75, all men. And there were plenty of guys out there berating themselves, using, profane language pretty loudly. And, there was definitely some bad behavior. So this isn't just restricted to junior players or younger players. This happens. And I'm watching this, putting on sort of my sports psych professional hat on here for a second, just sort of like, oh, it's very interesting. These guys are, they're at a certain age and they're still beating themselves up. They still think for some reason this is going to help them. And so it's almost like they're oblivious that there's another way to it. And so, like, if you don't know there's a choice, how can you possibly be good at making the choice? Or they've convinced themselves that well, this is what works for me. We often hear rationalizations of such behavior. Well, it was just for a second, or et cetera. And so I think, what you said earlier is really important, that we start to look at all of these things, attitudes, behaviors that we can really control, and understand what are the right choices that will help me to perform better, to play better, to perform better mentally, emotionally, physically, in these different categories. Because if you're not aware of what those behaviors are, or that you even have a choice, then really realizing that is the first step in making sure that your behaviors are aligned with your mission and your goals.
Absolutely. And I think I agree that the first step is recognizing that you have a choice. And I think, another one of the first steps is awareness, right? Can we be aware? Can we, recognize what our behavior is in the moment? I think sometimes people are acting in the way that you describe, people of all levels, whether that's junior players, whether that's adult players in tournaments and in leagues and, professional players, we see it all. And we see it at all levels. So I think, yeah, once we can recognize, yeah, this is a choice. And then once in the moment, can we start to bring awareness to our behavior? Can we start to bring awareness to our self-talk? Can we sort of catch ourselves in the moment rather than just acting on it? I think a lot of people are, you know, they're acting a certain way because maybe they've never necessarily acted otherwise, or they just think this is their default state, this is the way that they act, and they don't necessarily recognize that not only is it a choice, but it's a skill that can be worked on over time. And how we work on that skill is maybe a different question. And I think there's ways that through journaling we can start to recognize what we're doing and bring more awareness to that process. I think through through even something like video, which I think we've talked about on air and off air, but through video we can start to, if you can watch yourself play a match, for instance, or even practice, you might pick up certain things that maybe you're not as aware of. Maybe you recognize what am I doing in between points? How am I spending that time? Maybe you start to recognize, okay, maybe I'm not using my routine in between points the way that I want to. Maybe my body language, it doesn't look great. And I was under the impression that I had, really positive body language, but as I watch this video back, that's clearly not the case. So I think we can use some of these different tools to our advantage to bring more awareness to the situation and start to really recognize, how am I handling these moments? And, and I think over time, it's definitely not a quick process, but over time, once we recognize that we do have agency, we do have choice and autonomy, in terms of how we act, in terms of making change in this area. And once we can be more aware of it, and maybe also we can add to that some intention. Can I set an intention for the self-talk that I want? Can I set an intention for the body language that I want? Can I set an intention for how I'm going to spend time in between points, how I'm going to prepare? Can I at least plan out some of these things? That doesn't mean I'm going to be perfect at it and not make any mistakes, but can I at least have that intention? I think with, some of these different ingredients of, recognizing we have the choice, that awareness piece and that intention piece, over time we can, start to really move in a positive direction.
Yeah. And I think once you realize that you have that, or let's say you see it on video, I think you just have to make that decision that this needs to change. I think that's also like a lot of what the quote is about. It's, you need to, if you're having sort of behavioral issues on the court and then you recognize it and you see it, you have to make a commitment to do better with that. And that's hard, as you said. I think I wrote a blog post a few years ago about like how to make hard decisions, and thinking that generally in tennis, the hard choice is the right choice. So, for example, you miss a shot. It's very easy and natural to get upset. That's the easy choice. The hard choice is to stay calm and reset yourself and focus on the next point. But in that, in that moment, the hard choice is the right one. And so very often in a tennis match, learning to take the harder road will lead to something better. And so one way to begin to train yourself for that is to try to do little hard things even during the day, because you may not realize you have choices all day long. You have choices of things that you could do, and you could actually intentionally choose to do them maybe in a little harder way. So for example, stairs versus an elevator. You could choose to take the stairs. Now, of course, you have to realize that you have the agency to choose between those two things. Most people wouldn't even think about that. They might just go straight to the elevator. So it's again, awareness, as you said, Josh, that there is a choice, and choosing the stairs, perhaps, depending on your, physical situation, will also have some benefits. You'll get a little bit more exercise out of that. Similar, you go to a store and you're in a parking lot, park far away and walk. Make that choice. Better for your car. Nobody's going to hit you or anything. You don't have to worry about backing out or whatever. But it's, again, a way to choose to do little hard things. And so what you're training your brain to do is to get better at choosing the hard thing, knowing that the hard thing has benefits. And in tennis, we just had one scenario there. There are many others in which it's harder to do the right thing than it is to do a more counterproductive behavior. In a closing situation, it's much easier to rush and try to get it over with. It's a lot harder to choose to slow down, follow your routine, and stay disciplined with your game. How do we learn to train these things? Is just, even off court, just learn to realize how much choice you actually have in all situations, and try to make decisions that are more beneficial to what you're trying to do.
Absolutely. I think recognizing that, if it was easy, everyone would be doing it.
That's right.
Right. If it was, being able to maybe push past that easy decision and think about, what is maybe the harder or the right decision, the right sort of operating system for yourself as you're playing. And I think, we can get there more often by trying to be in a state of responding rather than reacting to different situations. And I think, sometimes it's, important to maybe clarify what is meant by that. Where I think when I think of reacting, I think of, there's a situation and you just react right away, split second, not really thinking about it, not planning out what you want to do, not thinking through any pros and cons or anything, just reacting. Almost like, just.
It's more emotional generally too, right?
Exactly. And responding is, it can still be quick, it could still be fast, but responding is, I think, more planned out. I've planned out how I want to respond, and more thoughtful. I'm thinking through what are the options, what are the advantages, disadvantages, and being able to make more of a rational decision in the moment and choose my response rather than emotionally reacting, where it's like, almost like there's two people at a, there's, I almost think of like hockey or something like that. So a player gets checked into the boards and the other player reacts, and then that player reacts, and then then they're in a scuffle, right? And I think that can happen pretty quickly, and there's not necessarily a ton of time to always like stop, take a deep breath, think through what my next steps are. It's often just very reactive, very quick. Where instead, can we get to a point where we can respond, where we can slow things down and choose, how am I going to respond? What is my next step? And I think when we think about, in a tennis match, you have those breaks of time, right? You have changeovers. You have that time in between points, right? So you have that period of time where instead of just, okay, I lost the last point, and then I'm going into the next point in a more of a reactive state, I'm able to use some of my tools. I'm able to use my breath, use my self-talk, maybe go to my towel, slow things down, have a clear plan, and really choose how I want to respond going into that next point. And I think, the more that we can be in that sort of responsive state of mind, Brian, you brought up decision-making earlier. First of all, we make better decisions. And second of all, our behavior is going to be better. We're going to do fewer things that we end up regretting. We're going to be, more so operating in a way where we're able to be more thoughtful and rational with our actions.
Yeah, I think reacting and responding is a great concept for everyone to try to understand more and even evaluate their own games and their own performances on court. How much am I reacting? How much am I responding? Can I make a commitment to respond more? Because I think the thing they have in common is they both do understand what happened, but one has much more of a forward-looking view. Reacting tends to keep us in the past because it's usually about the last point or the last couple of points, where responding keeps us moving along with the match. We're able to stay more present when we respond. When we react, we tend to be a little bit behind time-wise. Maybe stuck on that last point, stuck on that last call. Can't believe that happened in that last game. We're still getting very emotional. And I think there's also, Josh, sort of a body chemistry impact with reacting versus responding. Responding, I think, really is a way of valuing how you feel and trying to continue to feel good or feel better, where reacting tends to corrupt your body chemistry. You may be changing levels of cortisol and testosterone and adrenaline and so forth, maybe in ways that are counterproductive to you playing well. And so when we talk about reacting, I think that falls into the category generally of behavior that's counterproductive, which you've probably heard this from players or even parents and coaches, in which they are saying that some of this behavior does happen, but they try to excuse it or explain it away or rationalize it. And I think this is something certainly for parents and coaches or people around a player or performance team to be aware of, that the consequences of this behavior should be addressed quickly. Otherwise, you're simply training this behavior to repeat. So by allowing it to go on and go on and go on, the player is actually perfecting this behavior under certain circumstances through the repetition. And I think that's part of the idea with the quote as well, is that when we see such behaviors, we do want to recognize it, be aware of it, and begin to address it so we can improve the skill. But the more that we explain it away or rationalize it, the longer it will take the player to get to a place where they can respond and they can have more productive behaviors and really begin to master, as you were saying earlier, Josh, the controllables.
Totally. And I should give credit to, I think it was Brian Kane,
Okay.
who mentioned that, that concept. But yeah, absolutely. And I think, there's definitely a role for, depending on a player's level, a coach or a sports psychology professional, or maybe a parent of a junior player, to step in and to be clear when behavior hasn't reached the level that they're capable of. And we see this, to be very clear, we see this with the best players in the world. There are times where they get frustrated, where they, don't act with the best sportsmanship, where they throw their rackets, where they yell at themselves. So I don't necessarily always think that the best players in the world are, I think ideally they're role models, and I think they have moments of, really admirable qualities. But I think there's also examples of times where, some of these best players in the world don't necessarily act in ways that everybody else can look up to, unfortunately. But I think sometimes that in a certain way leads to that behavior being excused, because we watch some of these players and it almost feels like, they were able to get to the top of the game with this sort of behavior. So therefore somehow it's okay, or it's excusable, or, it doesn't get in the way. But I think, I think it's on, it's on parents, coaches, sports psychology professionals, the team that a player has around them to help reinforce that sort of behavior that is expected and is and just also being clear about why, right? That and I think there's a number of reasons why we want this behavior, right? First of all, we have a reputation that goes far beyond just our tennis game. I think that's one big reason. Number two, our performance can be held back from our behavior. It can our behavior from our attitude. These things can hold us back. And number three, you never really know who's watching, right? If a high school player or junior player playing USTA tournaments is playing and not acting in the best way, you never know who's watching the match. People talk. Their tennis community is not always that big. Or an adult player, right? You're playing at your local park or tennis club, and you never know who you're playing against, or yeah, word can travel, and it shouldn't just be about our reputation. It should be about something maybe deeper than that in terms of what is the type of person that we're trying to be and we're trying to become, and can we, it's not all about winning. It's can we exhibit that on the court, regardless of what's happening, regardless of that frustration in terms of how you're playing on a particular day, regardless of if you're winning or losing, regardless also of how your opponent is acting. But can you, strive to be that person and player that you're trying to be, and try to, exhibit that behavior that goes along with that. And it doesn't mean you're going to be perfect, but can you, really strive to maintain those goals that you have for yourself, and also be able to hold yourself accountable, be able to reflect and have a system of doing that so that you can not fall into the same traps, and do the same sorts of things and make the same sorts of mistakes over and over again, but instead learn from these experiences and improve over time.
Yeah, so that if there is some bad behavior, that it's for sure the exception, not the rule.
Yep.
And so I think that's important. One of my favorite quotes from Tal Ben-Shahar, one of the superstars of the positive psychology world, is you have to give yourself permission to be human. And that's coming from someone who was a perfectionist himself. He has a great book called The Pursuit of Perfection. So if you have perfectionist tendencies, good book to check out. But yeah, we're not looking for perfection here, but we are looking to improve so that our behavior, the norm of it is good and positive. There might be exceptions every now and then, but I think just knowing what the right behavior is, what good behaviors are important. And you mentioned Roger Federer earlier. All right. So if you're watching pro players and saying, well, it's okay, they do it. Well, why not also recognize the evolution of Roger Federer? When he acted poorly, his results were not nearly what they were when he was able to get things under better control. It's a perfect example of why you want to be aware of your behaviors and how they're affecting your performances and your outcomes, and then deal with it, and then improve those behaviors as skills so that you can master that more. And then you'll see, hopefully, more consistency in the quality of how you play, and the quality of how you handle situations, the quality of your ability to make good decisions, whether it's about shot selection or about how to respond to whatever is happening on the court. So I think you're right. There is some level of looking at pros who are not perfect. They're very human, and seeing what they do. But granted, they're also not doing it perhaps the percentage of time that other players might be at other levels of the game. It's just that when they do it, it gets magnified and amplified through, social media channels and YouTube and things like that. So it gets sort of viral in a way, even though that might have been one moment out of, I don't know, 75, 100 points. Where if we look at perhaps other levels of play, maybe the percentage of poor behavior is higher in points. So, but I think Roger Federer's evolution is a fantastic one to look at in terms of how he changed his behavior. It was obviously recognized, and look what happened afterwards.
Definitely. Definitely. I think he's a great example of that. I think there's other examples of players that have improved on that over time. And I agree that, you know, we can choose how we view a situation, right? We could see a player throw their racket and we could say, oh, they're not being the best role model or best, person to look up to there, or we can understand, first of all, there's a lot of bright lights and TV cameras on them at every moment. They're not going to be perfect. There's a lot of pressure riding on them. And there's going to be those moments where they don't necessarily live up to their own standards. And, oftentimes when players are interviewed about that, they'll express that. They'll express some sort of regret or maybe saying they didn't handle that as well as they could have. But, we don't need to choose to focus on those moments. We can instead focus on the countless positive examples of players that have improved on this over time. We could choose to focus on, all the countless examples of players that are handling these moments really well. And, thinking about if it's a tiebreaker or it's a third set or, the match is on the line, watching how they try to battle past the nerves, the frustration, all of these moments. And again, not that they're always going to be perfect, but I think more often than not, they do tend to handle these moments pretty well. And, there's a lot of people that want to be in their position, that want to be at the top of the sport. And needless to say, only a tiny fraction of them actually get to that level. And I think, that's not by accident. It's some combination of their physical skills, their mental skills, luck, different factors, certainly. But I think, we also want to recognize that those people that do get to the top of the game do tend to be better in terms of how they can control their emotions, in terms of their behavior, in terms of a lot of these qualities. They are also under the microscope. And, when somebody does make a mistake, I remember, speaking of Roger Federer, I think I don't know what year. For some reason, the year 2009 is standing out to me, but that could be way off. But I remember there was, I think he had gotten to a point where he was, sort of getting more frustrated, maybe hadn't been at his best. And I think it was in Miami, but could have been elsewhere. He just threw and broke his racket and seemed to sort of let some frustration out. And I remember when it happened, there were a lot of people that talked about it. They said, oh, what is he doing? He doesn't usually act this way. There was a role model and all of that. And I think, it's not necessarily realistic that we expect these superstars to be perfect all the time. That's not realistic. That's a lot of pressure in itself. I think we can expect them to be human and make mistakes at times, but I think it's a lot about how they choose to respond to it. Did Federer then go and break a racket in his next match and yell at the umpire and the fans? No, I don't think he did. So I think can we be in some way accepting that mistakes will happen while trying to uphold our standards when it comes to behavior, but also really focus on our response and what we do after that mistake, because I think that can really say a lot too.
Yeah. And this all brings me back to something we've mentioned in a few of our recent episodes is Rafael Nadal's definition of personal satisfaction. Playing with the right attitude, giving it all you have out there and giving your best effort. And could we try to make sure that that's important to us when we leave the court? In essence, can you assess your personal satisfaction with what you did out there? And doing everything that you could, your best effort, great attitude. Yeah. So if you're starting to look at it that way, maybe you begin to see that certain things need to change, or maybe you're happy. I think the idea would be to strive to want to be personally satisfied, whether you won or you lost, with how you conducted yourself throughout the match. And the better you get at that, the more that you measure that, obviously, the better you'll get at it, right? The only way to improve at various things in any performance is to begin to measure them. And if you start assessing your own personal satisfaction, just even 1 to 10 with what I did today, it naturally should get better because you'll want to get higher and higher scores there. So that's something I've been working on with a few players, Josh, that are, higher level and struggling a little bit at times with some of this behavior. It's not like excessive, but it's enough to be somewhat self-sabotaging. That let's go more to a measurement of how satisfied you are with what you did out there. Because if you leave the court feeling like, all right, I did everything I could, with what I had today, well, what else can we ask of you? And it's a high bar, but I think it's still a worthy target to shoot for, because in the end, if you get better at that, you give yourself better chances of getting good results.
Definitely. How well satisfied am I? How did I feel like I maximized my abilities out there? Did I feel like I did everything that I could to play well? Did I try to act as well as I could in tough situations? I think those sorts of tough situations can really test us. And again, we're not always going to handle them as well as we want to, but can we feel like we at least did our best to handle those challenging situations when they occurred? So yeah, I think, being able to think about that satisfaction piece and did I learn? Did I learn from this experience? How would I handle that same situation next time? Can we articulate how we would try to handle, the same type of situation the next time we're in it? Because we are likely to be feeling that same exact way again on a tennis court, and probably sooner than later, right? We will feel frustrated again. We will have an opponent where we feel like they're cheating or making bad line calls against us again. We will play a player whose playing style we don't like or we don't enjoy playing against again sometime soon. So, all of these things will happen again. So I think it's, kind of goes back to a concept that we've talked about a lot in terms of, tennis being a lifetime sport and being something that you can play for, a long, long time, and that you're going to have a lot of matches in your career. So instead of viewing each one as sort of the end all be all and as maybe more important than it actually is, can we put things into perspective and understand sort of how this tennis match fits into the bigger picture, rather, and that this is a learning experience, that, everything is practice, as we've talked about in the past, and, view things like that rather than maybe viewing each match as somehow more important or more significant than it actually is.
Which, I think brings us back to the quote, because part of the discussion in the quote, or if you read into it, performance is something to be patient with, behavior is something to address immediately. If we look at a lot of players, though, they kind of reverse that, and they're looking for immediate results and not really paying so much attention to the behaviors. And I think that's what we're trying to get that to be reversed here, is pay more immediate attention to your behaviors, make sure that they are productive, they're responding to what's happening, not just reacting. And then with your performance, let that play out over time. Those performances will get better and better, but you have to learn to trust your own process, to create your own process and systems. And the better you get at that, and your behaviors are a part of it, then you'll begin to see more consistent, high-level results over time, depending on what level you're at. And so I think that's a big part of the quote as well, is not expecting behavior to be immediate. Oh, I did this. Why didn't that happen? And that there has to be some patience around that. But I think as players, we should probably be a little bit tougher on ourselves when it comes to the standards of our own behavior. Once we learn what the right choices are, and we learn how to be more proficient at it, we should be maybe a little bit more accountable to ourselves on what we should be doing out there, and not tolerate bad behavior nearly as much as we do.
Definitely, definitely. I think behavior can be seen in different ways, right? We can talk about maybe positive or negative behavior in terms of, how we're acting, but there's also other sorts of behaviors, right? Our work ethic is a behavior that we want to cultivate. Our attitude can be seen as a behavior in a certain way. We can think about our behaviors as sort of maybe our, sometimes our choices are the choices that we make, to behave in certain ways, both on the court and off the court. So I think it can be seen in different ways here, but recognizing, ultimately what is and what is not controllable. And really trying to focus on those pieces, and really mastering those pieces, I think is leads to that sort of satisfaction that we want, that ultimately we want. And that this type of satisfaction that I think is fulfilling in a way where it inspires us to get back out there and try to be a bit better the next time around.
Yeah, for sure. So, well, it's been a fascinating discussion about this quote. We got a lot out of that. Any final thoughts, Josh?
No, honestly, no. I mean, I think, there's definitely reflection that each player could do, in terms of thinking about their own behaviors. And again, we can think of that in different ways within matches, within our tennis training in general, and thinking about maybe certain moments where we felt like our behaviors really, reached our standards, reached the level that we wanted them to get to, and maybe other moments where they didn't. And can we compare and contrast? Can we try to learn from that as much as possible, rather than falling to that same trap over and over again, right? Can we try to learn and reflect from that? Not, I think there's different ways to reflect, and we actually did an episode recently about this in terms of certain questions you can ask yourself, in terms of reflecting and learning from a match. But can you, go through a process of reflecting as well, in addition to your behavior, can you also reflect on, in addition to your performance, can you also reflect on your behavior and really be clear about, okay, what are some of those moments where I reached my standards and those moments where I didn't reach my standards as it relates to my behavior? And what was the outcome? What was the outcome in terms of my performance, in terms of my fulfillment, in terms of when I look back at that match, what I think of it and what I think of myself in terms of how I was. And I think based on that, that can, make it a lot easier for us to move forward in the direction that we choose with intention.
Yeah, and then you'll understand the relationship between performance and behavior better.
Absolutely.
Right? And I think that's important. Cool. Well, that's our show for today. For more on today's episode, please check out the show notes. If you have any feedback or questions for me and Josh, please email us at tennisiqpodcast@gmail.com. If you're enjoying the content that Josh and I discuss each week, please rate and review the podcast so others can find it. Additionally, please subscribe to the show on your podcast platform of choice, including YouTube, so you can be notified of new episodes. Also, please check us out on Instagram. If you'd like to support the podcast, please visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/tennisiqpodcast/membership, where you can learn about the benefits of being part of the Tennis IQ podcast community. Thanks again, and we'll talk to you soon in our next episode.